going to spend some time with Charlotte Thompson Iserbyt, and back with us again, Anita Hogue. It's all about education, or what they used to call education here. I really find it very difficult to even imagine where we would be in terms of our knowledge of what has been done to this country if it weren't for Charlotte Iserbyt. She is one of my heroes, and I know many of you listening have bought her book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, and watch her website, her blog posts. But more than that, Charlotte has done things to wake up people. What their education system is being stolen from them, and it's being supplanted with a communist form of so-called education, which is nothing less than mass mind control and programming. And I'd like to spend a little time in this first hour with Charlotte to find out how she feels her efforts have proceeded and where they are today ever since she was a senior policy advisor at the Department of Education in the Reagan administration. Are you there, Charlotte?
Yes, I am, Jeff, and thank you very much for having us on again.
You're welcome.
The last interview was, I think, very successful. We've had a lot of contact since then, and it's through people like you that allow for this. There hasn't been enough of this because you asked me to give you a bit of a rundown on...
I'd like to. There are people listening. First, Let's say hello to Anita. Hi, Anita.
Hi, how are you tonight?
We're good, thank you. So if you can just hang in there, what I want to do is introduce Charlotte to people who don't know her and help them understand what an enormous contribution she has made, and without her, we would really be in the dark about what's been done. And this is a program, ladies and gentlemen, that goes back over 100 years. Planned, carefully staged, executed, actually brilliantly in some ways, by people who want this country to turn out young communist dolts. I don't know how else to say it. That's one way. But Charlotte, tell our listeners about your time at the DEA, what you found out, why you quit, and how you went back and obtained some materials. It's a great story. It's really a major motion picture.
Yeah, it really is. It's sort of like a James Bond in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, you bet.
Yeah, well, yes, I was selected. They picked me after Reagan was elected. President Reagan, who had promised to get rid of the U.S. Department of Ed. Yeah. The White House still was okay. The people in personnel were certainly all right, and they chose me. I was just one of the people selected to go down to actually bring the building down. And I had been a local school board member in Camden, Maine, and I'd seen everything there at the local level. It's absolutely, really appalled me. I've been out of the country for a good 20 years, and I went back and I ended up on the school board, and I was looking at these programs that had nothing to do with education. And Maine got the gold medal for taking the highest number of National Diffusion Network values-destroying programs of any other state in the country. So I had been sort of immersed in looking at this stuff and thinking, what on earth are they doing? I mean, this has nothing to do with academics. And so we were successful to a point on the school board. We had our little minority, of course, and occasionally we'd drag a liberal across the line, and he would vote with us, and we managed to kill the health education, and we killed some interesting National Diffusion Network programs, which I later, when I got into the Department of Ed, I got into the office, which had the National Diffusion Network, was part of my office. But anyway, so I was very active, and we started a group in Maine, Guardians of Education for Maine, and did well with that. We killed some programs there, too. This was back when really good conservatives, we'd get out in people's faces. Nowadays it's Facebook, It was in your face back then.
It was.
And so...
that's what really made it, in a way, more effective. People looking at other people in the eye and emotionally in many cases.
Throw a pie in the face. I tell you, nowadays you mention that, people go, oh, you wouldn't do that, would you? We did all those things anyway. So I was pulled in, and interestingly enough, it just was amazing. I was put into what I consider the most important office in the world in education, mainly because the United States is, the most important country in the world, and we're very involved, and we were hooked in with UNESCO. And when the Carter administration, when they voted on putting in the U.S. Department of Ed, which was not much worse than the Office of Ed that we'd had before, but one thing it did do, it hooked the office, the United States Department of Ed, with the rest of the world. There was an office in Paris, and we were hooked in there with OECD, the Office of Economic Cooperation and Development, et cetera. So the office that I went into was extremely important, and it had been headed up by, in the past, it would be headed up by the president of Harvard or Stanford or Columbia or whatever, high-up guy in the senior policy advisor job that I was put into. And so...
Who put you in that position?
Well, it's a fluke. I mean, it was White House personnel that put me in, but I do think the gal who was working there, I knew her very well, and I think she knew that I would be good in there because she knew what I'd been doing in Maine. And she knew I understood. I understood a lot was going on because I was absolutely devastated by what I'd seen going on in Maine. So that's why they put me there. And I didn't have any credentials, of course. I mean, I wasn't the president of Harvard or something. And what I saw was, because the guy who'd been in the job before I was in it left all the old papers, the old documents, and the new ones. It was all the history of what they'd done in the past and all the plans for the future.
How could this be?
Well, I don't know.
That's the part that amazes me. And you had access to it, no problem.
Yeah. Oh yeah, what fun! Can you imagine after fighting all of this stuff at the local level and then seeing
it in print, in policy, going back almost 100 years.
Oh yes, and then to see what they were going to do in the future. Well, Reagan was meant to get rid of the Department of Ed, but it was a completely different agenda. There was not going to be getting rid of any of the Department of Ed. In fact, the Democrats had since 1965 with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which actually began the performance-based Skinner method. In 1965, they determined that they changed education from what you know in your head. We had a wonderful education system, as you know, the best in the world up until then. What you know in your head to what you can do. That's when it changed to performance-based education. Now, prior to that, the Democrats had been highly successful in destroying probably all, maybe 70% of the children of America had their values pretty much affected, maybe not destroyed, through all the programs I'm just talking about.
Certainly corrupted and on the way to destruction.
Yes, that's what the Democrats did with the National Diffusion Network, the Pace Setters and Innovation, 800-page book? That happens to be on my son's website. That 800-page baby, Pace Setters, people can go look at that. There isn't one single page in that book that dealt with academics. And this was the plan for the American schools, totally to change the children's values, get rid of the values of mom and dad and the home and the church, to move forward into a global system, for actually a communist system. It really was. And
when was that published, that book?
That was published in 1969, I think.
Okay. Now, the point I want to make is that book really drew on 3/4 of a century or more of planning, of thoughts, of think tanks, you name it, and they were all involved with this. This was not a joke.
No, it's not. And by the way, in 1953, the hearings were held, the congressional hearings on the tax-exempt foundations. And those hearings basically were mostly devoted to the role of the foundations in changing education and to putting in a communist system. And Norman Dodd, you've heard of him, and
sure.
a lot of our people have. And there's a really good video at realityzone.com, and Ed Griffin did it with Norman Dodd in regard to the investigation, which was abruptly shut down by Eisenhower. He was president then, shut down by him, and mainly Republicans and Democrats getting together because they could not afford to have this information get out to the American people.
Right.
And during that investigation, Norman Dodd, who I knew, I met him, in the early 80s, wonderful man, and he told me this over dinner in Georgetown, in Washington, and I'll never forget that. This is the most extraordinary dinner I ever had. I really didn't even finish it. How could you finish it when someone tells you that he goes up to New York as part of the investigation, and Mr. Gaither had requested him to come up and said this is going to be off the record, and that is why you will not find what I'm going to tell you in the 3,000 pages, fascinating 3,000 pages, but what I'm going to tell you is not there. But I believe Norman Dodd. And he said that Mr. Gaither said, Mr. Dodd, we get our instructions from the White House. And those instructions are to use our money to change America's educational system, so and to change America so that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. And, of course, people are going to out there, and they rightfully can say, oh, well, the Soviet Union is dead. Well, I always say, yes, of its own inefficiency and everything, it went down. However, isms don't die. Communism is not dead, and the plans for the merger continued on.
And so many isms are out of the very same basket.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the plan went on, and then it certainly did go on, because in 1985, Ronald Reagan signed the education agreement with Gorbachev to merge the two systems. And then there was a second agreement in 1989, another agreement, which actually was interesting. I haven't talked about this in a long time. It called for putting up statues of Soviet Russian cultural figures in the United States. That's an interesting one, isn't it?
Wow.
Yes, it's really interesting. So in 1985, at the same time Reagan signed the agreement.
Reagan was aware of and involved with this?
Oh, yes, deeply.
Okay, well, people won't believe this. They just literally can't believe it.
Well, they'll believe it when it's all over with, and then they'll say they wish they'd listened. But they can't. I don't blame them for not believing it, because let's just point out that the neoconservative, I call them Trotskyites, because that's what they are.
Right.
The whole conservative movement has changed. It was good in the 70s. We had really good people then.
Well, I used to call it the preservative movement, trying to hang on to the values that we had.
Absolutely. But with Reagan and the agreements, and Carnegie Corporation as well, they, in effect, decided to put the Soviet education system in. And Carnegie signed agreements with the Soviet Academy of Science.
Hard to believe. Just amazing. Yeah, that's why I wanted to talk about
and
this.
And that agreement was to develop computer courseware for early elementary school children in Marxist critical thinking. And that agreement went on and on. I'm sure it's probably still going on.